Hello and welcome. My name is Suzanne Anderson. I'm a psychologist, coach, facilitator, and founder of the Mysterial Woman, the co-author of the book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. And I am excited to be in a conversation with you today on this International Women's Day, if you're watching it on the day that I'm sending out this little video, with my dear friend and colleague, Nota Lucas, who's with me virtually. And we're going to have a conversation today, and Nota's going to guide the conversation in her brilliant way. She's done all of my Mysterial Woman programs over many years, is now faculty and Mysterial coach working with our depth programs, and a woman leader in her own right from her own background in years of public service. So I am going to begin by inviting you, Nota, to set the stage as you'd like to do, and then I'll drop into the role of conversationalist with you.
Great, beautiful. Thank you so much, Suzanne. And I'm really, truly delighted to be here with you today and with those who are watching either today or down the road, because I have been longing to have this conversation with you for the last 4 months, ever since really the Harvey Weinstein scandal blew up on, I cannot believe it, October 5th of 2017, only 4 months ago. And it feels like an age.
It does feel like an age. I totally agree. It's almost like it was a triggering event for something that sent the culture into this sort of liminal, we call liminal state, like a state of shock and excitement and arousal. And often those times do not have normal chronos time dimensions involved in them. They're more kairos time, where it's like, whoa, this has been going on forever and it just started.
Yeah, I found myself thinking about the tipping point concept, Malcolm Gladwell's concept, which is, it feels really potent, because clearly we know this is not new. We know things have been happening all along, and yet I don't want to belabor the point about why did it happen now. The fact is that it did happen, and I see it as a potential time of great change, and which is, I think, why we want to have this conversation honoring International Women's Day. And I'd really love to hear you share about what we are seeing now from the perspective of the Mysterial lens.
Yes, well, I'd love to do that. And I actually wanted to start with saying, thinking about International Women's Day, because I've been in the work of working with women and leadership now for over 15 years. And every year we would circle around to March the 8th, and I'd tell people it was International Women's Day. And most people did not know even what that was, or wasn't really celebrated, or it was sort of celebrated in some circles and maybe made it to the paper, maybe didn't. But I do sense something different, and I suspect this year there's going to be a different momentum around International Women's Day, as was also true last year. And I did a little look into the history of the day itself. And here in the United States, in 1909, we had the first National Women's Day. It was actually celebrated on February 28th at that time, and it was supposedly in honor of the 1908 garment workers' strike in New York, and women were protesting work conditions. So Women's Day was really a protest day in a certain sense. And there were these other little acupuncture points along the way where that day got a little more energy. And then in about 1917, this is when it turned into what we now think of as International Women's Day, right? This was against the backdrop of the war in Russia, and in Russia, and again, in terms of protest, women were striking for what they called bread and peace on the last Sunday in February, which happened to be March the 8th. in the Gregorian calendar. So as a result of that protest, 4 days later, the Tsar abdicated and a provisional government granted women the right to vote. So it was a pretty big thing that happened. And then in 1975, it made its way into International Women's, actually that 1975 was International Women's Year, and the United Nations started to celebrate March the 8th as International Women's Day. So, here we are now, and I think in some ways, I want the conversation I'd like to have with all of you listening is to put what we're seeing happen, let's say in the Me Too movement, for example, into the context of a larger evolutionary arc. The way I see it is, you say, no, what's my Mysterial lens on this?
Right.
I don't feel that the Me Too movement, or what's arising now in the women's marches that we've had and this kind of galvanizing, has come out of the blue. It has not come out of the blue. It's almost been waiting for the right conditions for the fire to activate. And I can say here in the United States, I think the electing of President Trump and many of his advisors around him and their way of leading and their value set, which is, I would say, much more connected to some of the more patriarchal mindsets that we thought we were leaving behind. In a certain way, this being someone like President Trump, some people have called him the predator in chief, who overtly has been proud of his ability to accost women and grab them wherever he wants, is now the leader of the United States. The president of the United States is I think, so rattled the paradigm of normalcy around the way men and women have related, that some of these shadow elements are finally able to be seen. Does that make sense to you if I just put that in the current context first?
It absolutely does. And I'm delighted to hear you kind of enter the conversation in this way, because in fact, the reason that I want to have the conversation, and I think will be of interest to others as well, is there's such power in the meaning making that is possible through, I think, particularly the way that you have approached the Mysterial woman. And I want to make no mistake. I mean, we are at the edge of change,
Mm-hmm.
and the more we can see clearly, I think both the what's at stake here and make meaning of it, the easier of a time we'll have is birthing this new time and culture.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's essential, and that we have a context for what's happening, that we can actually see the narrative inside a story that is not just about collapse or an end. And that is what I have hoped that the book that we published a couple of years ago might be able to convey, in that it's getting out in the world and actually presenting a story or a narrative, a way of looking at this moment a little differently than just doom and gloom. So let me put that in context just a little bit. No,
perfect. Thank you.
I think, and in fact, I think I'm going to use a slide that I'll share my screen here in a moment, because it's easier to see this visually or to capture the essence of this visually, to put this present moment in context of a much larger arc of time, the movement of culture and consciousness. So let me just do that. Share my screen. Okay, so let's see here. You should be seeing, are you seeing a slide that says 7 waves of consciousness and culture?
I am.
Great, okay. So what I'm going to show you is not something that my co-author and I invented. It's actually these 7 waves of consciousness and culture are agreed upon by most historians and developmentalists. These major nexus points when there was profound change in the way in our capacity, if you look at the vertical grid here, in our complexity and in our consciousness occurred. And we'll look at these on the horizontal grid across time. Now, what we've done is, and when we began to look at this, this current moment, we went back in time to see how did this arise, and we've given sort of a designation to these waves through masculine and feminine, looking at them as, was it a feminine wave that came in? Was it a more masculine wave that came in? And let me just say a bit about that as we go along. So every time a new wave comes in, first of all, it's important to understand that there is a new worldview. That's the idea, that basically the consciousness we have creates a life, and then it creates a life or conditions that are more complex than our consciousness. So that requires us then to grow more capacity. Albert Einstein said that so well in his well-known quote, which is basically, and paraphrased, we can't solve the problems of today with the consciousness that created them yesterday. Which is basically saying that we need to develop. So every time we meet one of those junctures where the life conditions are more demanding than our consciousness is complex to meet them, we're required to grow. We have a new worldview. We have a new way of engaging in exchanging of goods, a new economic mode, and we have a new leadership paradigm. So we go way back in the early days of the human story, and the first epoch, we call this a feminine epoch, first 50,000 years. The first 2 waves came in there, what's known as the archaic wave and the tribal wave, but all of these had to do with this more kind of mothering energy of being collected in the clan and very connected to the earth, and you're in this big circle of the family unit. And then at a certain point, and I'm going to go over this at a very high level just so that we can carry on in our conversation, but to give you the anchor points. Then at a certain point, basically, there were so many that we could say there was a kind of what can happen, which is a sort of suffocating nature of the clan. And in the midst of that, individual identity starts to arise. We could call this the beginning. We call this the beginning of the masculine epoch. Like, I want to break away from that. I want to break out from that. And the warring tribes came in and conquered the more earth-based agrarian cultures. And we see the first wave come in of the warrior, and a very heroic wave, we could call it. And remember, in each one of these, as we're looking at the vertical grid, there's a new way of leading coming in here. Now we have the emperor come in, sitting in that role inside the warrior consciousness. Then we have the traditional wave come in, which is more a monarch. And we have the executive of the modern wave coming in the industrial age. So all of these waves, we could say, heroic being the first one, more father-like being the traditional one, and then the third wave being more hero and father, like the marriage of these two. But this is 5,000 years of a masculine paradigm. That's a long time. And this is recorded history, so this is what we remember. Actually, we've had 50,000 years before that of a more feminine epoch. And then in the 60s, we see the second feminine wave come in. And this energy was very different from the mothering energy. This was kind of a busting up energy. This was a dynamic feminine energy of equal rights, sexual revolution, drugs, rock and roll, hippies, back to the earth. This was pushing against, in many ways, this 5,000 years of a more structured way of being and doing that was modeled in the masculine paradigm. And it did its job in the sense of breaking open the domains that women actually needed to enter into, to come into these yang structures and participate, bring their intelligence into these domains. But that was never meant to be the end. This is evolution's move. That was like the first move. And then we find ourselves now, right? That was the postmodern wave, and on the edge of this new wave that some are calling integral, seventh wave, that's trying to come in now. And what will that be? What is the nature of that next wave coming in? Well, what we see is that we are in right now this transition time. As women, we've been on this very steep 50 plus year learning curve, which is really phenomenal if you think of what actually we have accomplished as women in 50 years because of everything that was laid out before. And now it is really the question as to, well, what is this next wave, and what part do women play in this? And I'm going to just stop share and come on back here to say I wanted to show you that so that you could see this moment as the turbulent transition time that it is. And what we do know from history is that every time there's been an old wave is dying and the new wave is rising, those are times of a lot of chaos. That's the way it goes in these big culture changes. So that there's chaos right now and confusion and turbulence and disorienting is a part of the time. So it becomes really, I think, important for us as women in particular, which is the work that I'm doing with women, to actually use the momentum of this heat, the heat of this time, to forge a very new consciousness. And that's, I think what we're going to have a conversation about, that this isn't a mistake. It isn't somewhere we shouldn't be right now. It's actually quite natural that we would be here in this time of tipping, but what direction it will go, this we do not know. And in many ways, it's up to us to be determining that, depending on how we are able to shape these times.
I think that's a really beautiful place to begin the conversation. I think that perspective, that context is really helpful. And I wonder if now might be a good time for us so what comes to me is when I think about chaos is how to look at the chaotic situation in a way that I can understand what I'm really seeing instead of just throwing my hands up in the air and say, wow, this is like a lot of stuff. So I wonder if you might want to share from the standpoint of the Mysterial work a little about the way you see the feminine and masculine shadows playing out here, as that might help us look at the threads that we're seeing and to understand and make meaning of them.
Yeah, right. And so let me just say maybe speak a little bit about shadow and what does Noda mean by that, the feminine and masculine shadow. I think you can think about the term shadow has been used to talk about, Carl Jung actually started using that at the turn of the century. Simple way to think about it is anything that the light of the conscious mind does not want to acknowledge. So parts of ourselves that in our individual shadows that we put away because in the early conditioning of our family of origin, we learned that these parts of ourselves or this way of being did not get us the love, safety, and belonging that we wanted, and so we just disown it. That's both our golden shadow, the good, you could say the parts of our own genius, but it's also our darker shadow. And the same is true collectively, that we do the same. We agree to, you could say, for example, the Me Too movement right now, and what we're seeing, this shadow has been, as many are reporting, this is not new that this is going on. But now because in a certain sense of the conditions, as I said before, there is the ability for the conscious mind to look at this collective shadow of power over women through the sexual domain and actually acknowledge it. So it's like all of a sudden it's not that it didn't exist, it's just we didn't want to look at it before. And now we have the capacity to look at it. So yeah, the way that I would say, my own view about feminine and masculine really expanded when I was doing the research in the last 15 years that led up to the book with women in my women's leadership programs, trying to understand actually what did feminine and masculine mean in women. What is that? And initially, I would say I had a view about feminine and masculine was more simplistic, and it got greatly expanded. So what I'd like to share is how I see feminine and masculine now in terms of two very distinct polarities, and a little bit about the shadows that I see connected to each of the feminine or yin essences and masculine or yang essences. So let's start with the mother archetype, which is one of the primary archetypes and the first that lights up in a woman's psyche when we're coming to the world. There are two different shadows, and one way to look at shadow is, as I've said, that which we don't want to have a relationship with. But one way to catch a glimpse is through the principle also by Carl Jung of an archetype. So when I say the mother archetype, I mean, it's like, think of this like a magnet in the psyche, in the unconscious that lights up, and then our personality starts to, like little iron filings, kind of arrange around it. And depending on our structure and the family of origin we grew up in, we're going to have a robust relationship with that archetype or we're not. But what we tend to do is, when relative to these archetypes, is either we express it in a healthy way, and actually usually there's some combination of all of these that happen, but there's some elements of that archetype that we express in a healthy way. Or we might over-identify it with the archetype. That would be like what I call an active shadow. Or we under-identify with the archetype. That would be a more passive shadow. Okay, so then when we look at the mother now, the over-identifying with the archetype is a shadow that I call the devourer. And this is that tendency to be the devouring mother. I will look after everybody. I will take care of everything. I am responsible for everything. I am all controlling. And my sense of identity is dependent on my ability to care for everything. And very, very often, that's at my own expense. And it's also often at the expense of the other's autonomy and individuation. Now, that's the active shadow. But the other side of that is the neglector. And often women will have both of these. The neglector is, I don't want a relationship with that archetype. That is too much. And I'm not going to have any healthy mother here for sure, because I'm too busy out here. So the neglector relative to the self often comes in. And, we really see this in, I think, the Me Too movement. Part of what's happening now is women coming back to themselves, being able to actually acknowledge what went on. When the neglector's in focus, you don't do that. You can just go numb to the realities of what's happening in your body, what has occurred here. So, and then the other end of that feminine archetype is the masculine archetype here, the very fiery archetype I call the hero. And this archetype in a woman shows up in its healthiest way. It's when we're able to have agency in the world, and we have goals, and we accomplish things, and we make things happen. We have clear boundaries. We have clear no's, clear yeses. But when it's in an active shadow, then it's the dominator, what I call the dominator. It is, I have to do to be of value, and I'm going to do everything there is to do. And there's no pause button. There is enormous valuing of doing over being, and just simply resting is not acceptable. You have to deserve to take a holiday if you happen to work hard enough. And the other side of that is the capitulator, the passive shadow of the hero, which is, whoa, that I'm not the one. I can't do that thing. I can't take a stand for this. I can't take a stand for myself. I just keep saying yes to everything, even though I know that a healthy no is required. And again, we see this in the Me Too movement. What is it to really have a very clear yes in ourselves to protecting our own bodies and being able to say that and stand in that clearly and publicly. But the capitulator kind of has us, it's not worth it. I don't want to rock the boat. I'm going to lose too much if I do that. So we see, I think this primary polarity, we see these shadows really coming up. No, before I go into the second polarity, is there anything you want to add there, or?
No, I think that's really great. Sort of setting the stage, it's wonderful foundation for us to be able to talk more, I think maybe coherently around what we're seeing in the chaos right now. And I would love to just hear you expand on that a little bit more in terms of how these shadows are showing up.
Right. Well, then we go to the third archetype in the sequence, and this is a sequence, which is the father archetype. Now, when a woman has healthy access to this archetype, we are able to stand in our own true authority. We have a sense of our own contribution, and we have the capacity to build the structures in the world that will let us grow that genius and make our creative contribution. And then this is where culture, the dominant cultural paradigm is right now. As I've said, we've come out of the hero and then the father and then the hero father. So this is, this is where culture is still dominantly in this the overdrive of the father archetype in its active shadow. It's what an archetype I call the shadow I call the judge, which is very much a little different than the dominator in the hero, which is that I will just keep going and going and going and going and doing and doing and doing. Here we have, I have the right way. I know how things are, and it's my way or the highway. And I am in judgment of anybody who does not agree with me. And the way that has been relative to women, of course, women, this view here in the unhealthy toxic masculine is that a woman's ways of being, women's ways of knowing, women's ways of doing are all second class. What really matters is rational, logical, power over. I'm the king of the castle. My truth is, as I've said, the truth. And then, we can it's not hard to see that archetype played out in the White House.
No, and in fact, Suzanne, if I can just interrupt for a moment, I was thinking that same thing, that I think one of the very challenging things right now, and before you come back to completing the shadow assessment here, is that is how painful it is to bring a new leadership paradigm in when there's so much rage and anger and power over associated with the leadership model, and even to the point of questioning the media. And so that there's no other way to get a new voice out there. And I feel like almost we are almost dying of asphyxiation because we can't, it's being very hard to find how we're going to breathe new life into a more open way of leading. So right. Let's to
right. And then that brings it back to us. And as I've said often, I think men and women, but I'm going to speak about women here because it's the work I'm doing, are in the midst of a profound rite of passage right now. And that, just like at the end of that 50,000 years of that dominant yin mother archetype time, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of the sense of suffocation of that old model, people wanting to bust out of it. This is pretty common. So that's where we are right now. And what it, of course, takes is those who are willing to let the heat of this fire, the fire of these times, awaken a new consciousness that lets us see a future that we actually cannot see inside the old consciousness. It simply isn't available. So opposite this, I think I spoke about the active shadow of the father archetype. The passive shadow here, in other words, whoa, I just don't want a relationship with that archetype, is a shadow I call the outsider. And that is basically, don't ask me to be the one to stand up and be seen and take the heat. I'm just going to go out here and, that's not my world out there. It's a little ostrich in the sand, kind of head in the sand sort of view of I'm not powerful enough and I don't belong and I'll never belong. And of course, many of us will flip between these two archetypes, sometimes feeling I'll never belong and then trying to show up and break into culture and make a contribution and then swinging back out to the outsider again and like, oh, it's not worth it. But then opposite this father archetype, which is that masculine, second masculine archetype, is a more dynamic feminine archetype. And I think this is the move, this actually first really lit up, as I said, when in the 1960s, when the wave, the second feminine epoch launched. In the best case scenario, that maiden energy is a kind of spontaneous, wild feminine. It's not the still, quiet, deep, womb-like nature of the mother archetype, right? It's very explosive and spontaneous, sexual, sensual, coloring outside the box, very creative, very engaged with others in unpredictable ways. And it's a wonderful dance partner to the structures of the father, which we actually need. We don't need to burn down the whole house in order to dance. Ideally, if we really see this, and this comes back to what you were saying earlier, Noda, about having the context, we can recognize we actually need healthy father. We need to show up in the world right now and be seen and find a way to make our contribution inside the structures, many of the structures that are in the point of collapse. And how do we stay steady when we're in the midst of that? And then the other end of it, how do we bring our own liberated expression, our own free expression? And this, I think usually when a new archetype comes in, it comes in with the shadow. And I think this archetype, when it launched in, came in with the active shadow of the maiden, which is the bohemian, something we call the bohemian. And we saw that. I think I was a bohemian.
I was with you.
Yeah. Or the passive shadow on the other side, which was the Puritan, that, well, I don't want anything to do with this wildness, and I'm going to just button everything up, and I'll make sure that I say all the right things and toe the line, and I am a good girl. I will be a good girl. I don't want to upset father.
Right.
A lot of the women in the work that we do, come in usually when this archetype is lighting up. And they think, I want to go back to where I was when I was younger and I felt so free. And one of the things that's such a relief to many women is to recognize the lighting up of this archetype as a move forward, not backward. And that's actually the developmental move to make individually, and I feel in terms of culture that we are required to now bring in the healthy maiden in relationship with the healthy father archetype, and take responsibility for the way those shadows have shown up. So that's the second polarity. If you want to add anything before I go into the last archetype.
Well, I will just add that what I love about the way I experience the maiden and the father now, because the father does sound kind of unsexy compared to the maiden, but that he gives, or it gives us staying power. So this creative energy of the maiden married to the father, the healthy father, gets the staying power, the commitment to actually take the inspiration all the way through to completion.
Yeah, beautiful. I think of it, sometimes I call it the steadfastness, that you just are. What Malcolm Gladwell talks about, this is the 10,000 hours that we put in. We find our genius in the mother. I think we actually connect to the ground of our being. In the healthy hero archetype, we ignite the fire. We actually have the capacity to do the actions required to bring that genius into the world. At the father, we're willing to be a stand for that, be visible, be seen, and then create the structures and plug into the structures in culture where we can make our contribution, which means practice. We got to do the thing again and again. It's the sort of, I often think of the father as the sobering essence. But then once that's in place, the fiery maiden, there's a kind of freedom then available for a creative expression, to see things, for innovation that we've never imagined before.
Which we dearly need right now, because what was coming in has never been here before.
That's right. And this is key to say, because, and this has to do with the very word Mysterial that we talk about, and the way of the Mysterial woman, because the word Mysterial describes this way of being that we began to see after hundreds of women had been through our program. So we couldn't find a word to describe a way of being that had an ability to be with ambiguity and uncertainty and the mystery, and also medial. Having this ability to bridge between differences, between masculine and feminine, between self and other, to hold multiple perspectives, to find this middle way. And those two words, mystery and medial, came together in the word Mysterial. And I remember when the word came through me, and my co-author and I were talking about it, was like, well, how can we invent a word? How do we have the right to invent a word? We can't do that. We looked it up, actually, to see if it already existed, which it didn't. and then we realized, well, if it's true that we're on the frothy edge of evolution, like we're bringing in something that hasn't been here before, then why would there be a word to describe that way of being? There wouldn't be. So that way of being, this very new way of being that brings together all of our feminine and masculine essences now, is a response to culture's need itself. In other words, the dying of the patriarchy is simply because it is not a match. That consciousness is not a match for the challenges. We actually need the feminine capacities to come back in, or to come in a way they've never been in before, and then to be married together with the masculine. So that sets the stage for the last essence I'll just mention, which is, I think, the archetype of the wise woman, the primary archetype called the crone, and it has never come in culture. We know it's tried to come in before and been burnt at the stake, but it's never been its time exactly. In my view, everything is preparing the way for this to light up in consciousness, because it's finally the archetype that can actually, the last feminine archetype of, the mother, maiden, crone that comes in, that's capable of holding feminine and masculine. It's like a steering function in the psyche. And interestingly, when, as I said before, when an archetype tries to come in, usually comes in with its shadow voice first. And we have seen a lot of the hag come in, which is the active shadow of the crone. under the guise of, I'm just saying it as it is, I'm being wise. But actually the crone, when it really lights up in the psyche, she holds or sort of wields what I call the sword that cuts together. It's telling the truth, but it's a kind of candor that is very compassionate. And it's designed to bring together or to let what is not true fall away. She's not afraid when that lights up in the psyche. You're not afraid to let things move out, to let go, for things to die. You understand there are things that come together and things that fall apart. And you're able to be steady here. And also, when this archetype comes in, you really understand the potency of partnering with the mystery, with the unknown. You know, as like not just a thing you tolerate, but that the new world that's trying to come into form comes in through an ability to hold the discomfort that's present in not knowing. And of course the passive shadow of the crone archetype is the denier. So that is that sense of, you know things, but you're certainly not going to really know, own that you know them, the truth that you know, the way you see, the ways of knowing that are beyond the left brain rational, your own intuitive sensing, your psychic knowing even. But it's like, no, I can't even go there. Mm-hmm. Will be shaken up. So that gives us kind of that lights up the archetypal map from my perspective. So this is like looking at the situation right now on this International Women's Day as a kind of, if we can, as a moment of tremendous potentiality. This is, if we needed conditions for birth, what starts the contraction, for example, in a birth cycle? For women, the first thing is the water breaks. Something breaks. And then there's a lot of discomfort. There's a lot of contraction that's going on while this new form, this new being is making its way into the world. If we can hold this moment like that, then I think it's really different. Then we can talk about, well, how do we create the enabling conditions for this to be a healthy birth? Because I believe we're giving birth to a new, almost species of woman in ourselves. Like, that's the opportunity, that we are literally giving birth to ways of seeing, thinking, being, like a whole new code operating in the system that's never been here before. And as we do that, then we could say that's happening in culture. We're giving birth to new ways of being together in culture that have never been seen before.
No, that's really beautiful to me, Suzanne. I feel sort of a relaxation in myself hearing even you talking about the crone in particular, because it's like, oh, right, it's going to be okay. The baby is going to come out. Right. The baby cannot go back in the other way. It is going to come out, and we need really wise midwives to help be with this process. We don't know how long it's going to take or what the baby's going to look like. So I wonder if this might be maybe a moment to ask for, I mean, one of the things I know would be helpful to me is when it gets difficult and confusing to read the papers, to hear the news, to see all the anger and the vitriol and whatnot, is what are some basic things that we can hold on to, remember, to help us see this as the positive outcome that's inherent here and that we desire? How can we be with that?
And this is probably a good way for us to end our conversation, actually, is I think for me to offer some just basic starting points, like let's say 3 key things you can do right now here in your own, relative to your own system. Because I think, there is both what we have to take care of here so that we are giving birth to this consciousness that's en route, as I've said. And then there are things we actually have to do in the world. We actually have to do things. We're going to have to, and we've been doing them, and we're marching, and we're signing petitions, and we're signing up for office, and we're finding out about things we've never had to find out about before. We cannot, go asleep. So it isn't just about making it all okay here. But I do believe my own work is, in a sense, designed to help women awaken the consciousness that then can choose wisely what it is we do in the world, because we cannot do everything. That's the old masculine model. I have to do to be of value. And the new is I am empowered to do what is mine to do. So really being able to have the consciousness that can discern what is mine to do and how am I going to do it wisely, strategically, in a way that makes a contribution. So the three things that come to me, one is you talked about a positive image. How do we hold a positive image? And this is actually key. One of the things we write about in the book is the research of a sociologist, Fred Pollock, who did this interesting study after the Second World War to look at, gathering data from all the European countries, what allowed a culture that was in the midst of tremendous transition, or even obviously after a war, a lot of destruction, to reorganize in a positive way or disintegrate, or not be able to, be a dark age as opposed to a renaissance would be the way to think of it. And what he found, the one factor, which is fascinating, that he found in all of these cultures that reorganized in a way that was more creative, more of a renaissance, was that there was a small group of people, didn't have to be the whole culture, the whole country, who held a positive vision of a new world. And they did that in the midst of very difficult circumstances. It wasn't like it was easy, it was very hard. But in the midst of their own current struggle, they could still have this positive image of the future. So I think that's the first thing is, take the time, and there are some practices in the book to do this, to connect with your deep longing, with what you desire, with the world you want to create, not just at large, but in your own very personal life. What does that look like? And what does that feel like? And even though you cannot imagine how you will get from here to there, to commit the time to really cultivate that relationship to this imaginal part of ourselves, this vision of a possible future, and anchor yourself in that on a daily basis. And that is not to go into denial about what is. It's actually, as I say, almost like it lights up the oak tree that is a potentiality inside the acorn. So that's the first thing I'd say. And then the second thing I would say is, as much as you can, to welcome discomfort. I think, humans, we're organized as humans to move toward comfort. That's an evolutionary behavior. We actually have to do something counter that right now, which is be willing to be uncomfortable as we differentiate from an old way of being, our more habitual ways of being, personally, and then the way we've been as women. We have to be willing to be with the discomfort that is part of the hard wiring. We're hardwired right now to get love, safety, and belonging in a particular way. And that way is, for many of us, outdated. And in order for that to shift, we have to do the deeper shadow work that requires us to be able to hang in there in the midst of discomfort. And how do you do that? Well, I would say, first of all, having practices like a mindfulness practice, Any practices that let you ground and center, a centering practice, you'll find some of these in my book and on my website, are all ways that you can settle down your fight, flight, or freeze response to everything that's going on right now. And from center then determine how to act. So, for example, Nona, you talked about the rage that's been building. This is, I think, very repressed rage, and that there's a healthy recognition of what's actually so. And this is, the ability to be with what is actually. No, I am really pissed, and to let yourself have that feeling, but not act from that place, because then we're just repeating the cycle that ignited the rage in the first place. So what is the information we can get from that rage? What is it we care about? For the sake of what am I going to act? And then how do I strategically and wisely act? The sword that cuts together. Yeah. And so to do that, we have to come back into our bodies. We have to come into our bodies and our feeling self, which has been cut off inside the masculine paradigm. When we started to develop the mind, I think, therefore I am. We lost track of all of the heart-centered emotional intelligence and the body intelligences, and we have to bring those back, because we're going to need all of our intelligences on board for meeting the challenges of this turbulent time. That's the second thing. The third thing is we need self-compassion. We need to be very gentle with ourselves. Those of us that are willing to be out there on the edge of evolution, it is not easy. We're going to lose things that we loved. We're going to feel feelings that we've not wanted to feel. We are going to be discouraged and afraid and angry. And we are going to grieve. Many of us already are grieving what we see happening to others, less, to the people around the world, to the earth herself. So how can we be with ourselves during these times gently? And actually, if on my website, when you sign up my mailing list, I give you a practice for self-compassion, and I have lots of resources on my page for you to really just start to be kind to the human part of you that is here so courageously right now. As a wise warrior, Joanna Macy talks about the women of these times, or of this era, as the Shambhala warrior, a woman who brings both her wisdom and her compassion together in actions that make a difference in the world. And I think we will need each other. That's what I would say here in the zone of self-compassion, to find the resonant communities where you can take off your armor and be loved and held, and others who share the vision that you share, so that you remember you are not alone, even though indeed you have to do what is yours to do. And my hope certainly is that the Mysterial movement is a community where women can feel that. Mysterial Woman Facebook page is a place where we're in conversation and supporting women who are awakening Mysterials, and there are many now groups and circles forming, and many different programs and ways that you can get supported. And I would definitely recommend that now.
Well, Suzanne, I want to thank you for inviting me to have this conversation with you today. And I'm very hopeful that what we speak of will resonate with those who are watching. And to underscore, those three final practices that you mentioned, is each one went right into my heart. That we must have hope in order to keep moving. And in order to keep moving, we must be able to stay with what is, be with the discomfort. And we must be able to mine the energy that's locked in rage in a positive way. Because if we just go into anger, as you said, I mean, it's actually very ineffective if it just goes off ungrounded. And yet it has such power if we can stay connected with the positive vision of the future. And then in those hard moments and those hard times, to be able to be with ourselves in compassion and with others who are also suffering. I mean, those are just really beautiful principles. And I really thank you for ending our conversation in this way. And I also would join you in inviting others to be with us in this Mysterial work, which has really been so life-changing for me, and I know for others. And thank you for leading the way.
Thank you, Noda. And it's been very rich to have this field within which to presence a Mysterial way of being the catalytic agents of transformation, who many generations from now, the women and men of the future will be thanking those of us now who really gave birth to a very new way of being that is the seed code, I believe, for the future. And I'd like to end with a poem. I use poetry a lot, as you know, as a beautiful way to kind of close our conversation. And this is a poem by Václav Havel, and it is called "It is I Who Must Begin." It is I who must begin. It is I who must begin. Once I begin, once I try, here and now, right where I am, not excusing myself by saying things would be easier elsewhere, without grand speeches and ostentatious gestures, but all the more persistently, to live in harmony with the voice of being as I understand it within myself. As soon as I begin that, I suddenly discover, to my surprise, that I am neither the only one, nor the first one, nor the most important one to have set out upon that road. Whether all is really lost or not depends entirely on whether or not I am lost. Whether all is really lost or not depends entirely on whether or not I am lost. I invite you to let those words into your heart if you've listened all the way to the end of this conversation. And I invite you to reach out and connect at mysterialwoman.com, Mysterial woman.com. And thank you for being in the conversation.